Hello friends, welcome back. In this tutorial we will study about how we can solve this 0-1 knapsack problem by dynamic programming. Now what is 0-1 knapsack problem? 0-1 knapsack problem is there is a knapsack in which we cannot put weight more than W. It means the capacity of knapsack is W, right? And there are n items. Each item has its own weight and value. Now we have to select items from these n items and put them into knapsack so that in knapsack we have maximum possible value, right? But when we put items, we have to keep in mind that this knapsack has a fixed capacity W. We cannot put weight more than W in this knapsack, right? Now, how will we solve this 0-1 knapsack problem by dynamic programming? Suppose there are P items, right? Each one of them has its own value and weight, right? And there is a knapsack of capacity W, right? Now to solve this 0-1 knapsack problem, we will make a D table with P plus 1 number of rows and W plus 1 number of columns. Rows are labeled with numbers from 0 to P and columns are labeled with numbers from 0 to W. All entries in row and column labeled with 0 are filled with 0, right? Now in this table D, the entry at row labeled with I and column labeled with J, we will store the maximum possible value of the selected items if we are allowed to take items from 1 to I and we have weight restriction of J, right? Now we have to fill the entries of this table. The entries of this table will be filled row wise from left to right, right? Now how we will fill the entries of this table? To fill the entries of this table, we will use this formula, right? Now what this formula signifies? Dij. Dij is the value which will be stored in D table at the row which is labeled by I and at the column which is labeled by J, right? So Dij represents the value which is stored in the table at the entry whose row is labeled by I and whose column is labeled by J, right? Now Di minus 1 J, right? This term represents the value which is stored in the D table at the entry whose row is labeled by I minus 1 and column is labeled by J, right? Ui is the value of ith item, right? Wi is the weight of ith item, right? And this term Di minus 1 J minus Wi, it represents the value which is stored in the D table at the entry whose row is labeled by I minus 1 and column is labeled by J minus Wi. Wi is the weight of ith item and Ui is the value of ith item, right? Now according to this formula, Dij will be the value which is the largest among these two values, right? Di. So when we have to fill the entry in a table whose row is labeled by I and column is labeled by J, right? Then we will have to compare the two values. One value which is stored at the entry whose row is labeled by I minus 1 and column is labeled by j, right? And second value will be ui. Ui is the value of ith item plus the value which is stored in the table at the entry whose row is labeled by I minus 1 and column is labeled by j minus wi, right? Where wi is the weight of ith item, right? Now the value which will be the largest, right? The value which will be the larger than the other one will be stored in the table at the entry whose row is labeled by I and column is labeled by j, right? It will be more clear after this example. Suppose we have to solve this knapsack problem. Here the capacity of knapsack is 5, right? And here 4 items are given to us. Weight of first item is 2 and its value is 3. Weight of second item is 3 and its value is 4. Weight of third item is 4 and its value is 5. And weight of fourth item is 5 and its value is 6, right? So what will we do? First of all, we will make a D table, right? Since the capacity of knapsack is 5, right? So there will be 6 columns in D table. Since there are 4 items, so there will be 5 rows in D table, right? Columns of D table are labeled by the numbers from 0 to 5, right? Because the capacity of knapsack is 5. Similarly, rows of this D table are labeled by the numbers from 0 to 4, right? Because there are 4 items, right? Now we have to fill the entries of this table row wise from left to right, right? So first of all, we will fill this entry. We will fill this entry of D table whose row is labeled by 1 and column is also labeled by 1, right? Now see, entries in the column which is labeled by 0 will be 0, right? All the entries in a column which is labeled by 0 will be 0, and all the entries in the row which is labeled by 0 are 0, right? Now we have to fill this entry whose row is labeled by 1 and column is also labeled by 1, right? Now in this entry we will store the maximum possible value of the selected item, right? If we are allowed to take only one item, 1, right? We are allowed to take only one item, that is the first item, and the weight restriction is 1, right? Now we are allowed to select only the first item and weight restriction is 1, right? Now weight of first item is 2, right? So we cannot select this item 1, right? So the maximum possible value of the selected item will be 0, because we cannot select the item number 1, right? We cannot select first item because weight restriction is 1, right? Now we have to fill this second entry, right? We have to fill this entry whose row is labeled by 1 and column is labeled by 2, right? Now see, here we have to write the maximum possible value of the selected item if we are allowed to select only first item and weight restriction is 2, right? Now see, weight of first item is 2, right? So here weight restriction is 2 and we are allowed to select only first item, so we can select first item, right? So the value of first item is 3, right? So the maximum possible value of the selected item, if we are allowed to select only first item and weight restriction is 2, will be 3, right? It is the maximum possible value. So here at this entry we will write 3. Now we have to fill this entry. right? Row label of this entry is 1 and column label is 3, right? So in this entry we have to write the maximal possible value of the selected items. We have to write the maximum possible value of the selected items if we are allowed to select from only one item, that is item number 1, that is first item, and we have weight restriction of 3, right? Since weight of item 1, right, weight of first item is 2, so we can select first item, right, and its value will be 3, right? Here we can select only one item, right, so value will always remain 3 if the weight restrictions are such that we can select this item 1. So in this row, right, for all the entries whose column label is more than or equal to 2, right, in this row all the entries whose column label is either greater than or equal to 2, right, these all entries will be 3, right? Now we have to fill this entry, right, entry whose row label is 2 and column label is 1. Now we have to fill this entry of T table whose row label is 2 and column label is 1, right? Now in this row, right, we will have to fill the entries, right, for any column labeled J. We will store the maximum possible values of the selected items if we are allowed to take items from first item and second item, and we have a weight restriction of J, right? Now see, the weight of second item is 3 and value of second item is 4. So here in this case value of Wi will be 3, right, and value of Ui will be 4, right? Now we have to fill this entry. Its row label is 2 and column label is 1. So here the value of I will be 2 and the value of J will be equal to 1, right? Now we have to fill this entry T 2 1, right? So to fill the entry at row label 2 and column label 1, we will have to compare two values, right? One value is at the which is stored at the entry whose row label is I minus 1 and column label is J, right? Here the value of I is 2, right? So value of I minus 1 will be 1. So the value which is stored at row labeled 1, right, and column labeled will also be 1, because here the value of J is also 1, right? Value of J is 1 and value of I is 2, right? So di minus 1 J, it means it is d11 because I minus 1 will be 1 and J is equal to 1, right? And the second value is Ui. Here the value of item number second is 4, so value of Ui is 4 plus di minus 1 J minus Wi. Wi is equal to 3, so di is 2, so I minus 1 will be 1, J minus Wi, right? Value of J is 1, so 1 minus 3 will be minus 2, right? Now we have to find the value which is largest among these two values, right? Now see, this value is not defined, d1 minus 2, right? because there is no column which is labeled by a negative number. So this term is not defined. So the largest among these two terms will be this term D11, right? Now the value which is stored at row labeled 1 and column labeled 1, right? The value which is stored at row labeled 1 and column labeled 1 is 0. So here we will write 0, right? Now we have to fill this entry whose row label is 2 and column label is also 2, right? So here the value of I will be 2 and the value of j will also be 2, because here the row label is 2 and column label is also 2. So value of I and j will be 2, right? Now again here the value of second item is 4. So ui will be equal to 4. Weight of second item is 3. So in this case value of wi will be 3. Now we will use this formula to fill the entry whose row is labeled by 2 and column is also labeled by 2, right? Now we have to find this entry's value, right? Now what does this term signifies? This term signifies di minus 1 j, right? Here the value of I is 2, right? So I minus 1 will be 1. Value of j is 2, right? Now this term ui, what is ui? Ui is 4, right? Plus d I minus 1, that is 2 minus 1 means 1. J minus wi, wi is 3 and j is 2. So 2 minus 3 is minus 1, right? Now we have to find the value which is largest among these two values, right? Now see here, this value is 4 plus d1 minus 1, right? This value is 4 plus the value which is stored in the table at row labeled 1 and column labeled minus 1, right? This term represents the value 4 plus the value which is stored in the table at entry whose row is labeled by 1 and column is labeled by minus 1. Now in this table there is no entry in which column is labeled by minus 1. So this term is not defined. So the largest among these two terms will be this term D12, right? And it signifies the value which is stored in the table at an entry whose row is labeled by 1 and column is labeled by 2. So the value which is stored in this table at the entry whose row is labeled by 1 and column is labeled by 2 is 3. So here D22 will be equal to 3. So here we will write 3, right? Now we have to fill this entry, right? Here the value of I will be 2 and value of j will be 3, right? So in this case value of I will be 2 and value of j will be 3. So again we will use this formula. So D23 will be equal to the maximum of di minus 1, that is 1. I minus 1 means 1 because value of I is 2, right? J is 3, right? This is di minus 1 j, right? Ui is 4, right? 4 plus di minus 1 means di minus 1 j minus wi. I minus 1 will be 1 and j, which is equal to 3 minus wi. Wi is also 3, so 3 minus 3 is 0, right? Now we have to find the largest value of among these two terms, right? the term whose value is largest among these two terms, right? Now this term signifies the value which is stored in the D table at an entry which is labeled whose row is labeled by 1 and column is labeled by 3, right? So in this D table, the value stored at an entry whose row is labeled by 1 and column is labeled by 3 is 3. Now the second term is 4 plus D10, right? So it is 4 plus the value which is stored at an entry whose column is labeled by 0 and row is labeled by 1, right? So in this D table, the value stored at an entry whose row is labeled by 1 and column is labeled by 0 is 0, right? So 4 plus 0 is 4. Now the value which is the largest among these two values is 4. So here D23 will be equal to 4. So here we will write 4, right? Now we will have to fill this entry whose row is labeled by 2 and column is labeled by 4, right? So here again we will use this formula, right? Here value of I will be 2 and value of j will be equal to 4, right? Now the D24 will be the maximum of this term, that is D14, and second term is UI. UI is 4 plus di minus 1 j minus wi. Wi is 3 and I is 2 and j is 4. So this term will be 1 d1 1, right? J minus wi will be 1, right? Now we have to find the term which is the largest among these two terms, the term whose value is the largest. D14, right? It is the value which is stored in the D table at an entry whose row is labeled by 1 and column is labeled by 4, right? And this value is 3, right? Now the value of this term is 4 plus D11, 4 plus value which is stored in D table at row labeled 1 and column labeled 1, and it is 0, right? So 4 plus 0 is 4, right? Now the value which is largest among these two values is 4. So here we will store 4, right? Now we have to fill this entry. Now we have to fill this entry. Row label of this entry is 2 and label of column of this entry is 5, right? So here the value of I is 2 and value of j is 5, right? Value of ui is 4 and wi is 3. Now we have to find the value of D25, right? So we will use this formula. It will be the maximum of these two terms, di minus 1j. So I is 2 and j is 5. So di minus 1j will be 1, 5. And second term is ui, that is 4 plus di minus 1 j minus wi. I minus 1 will be 1 and j minus wi will be 5 minus 3 and it will be 2, right? Now we have to find the value which is the largest among these two values, right? This term represents the value in the table which is stored at the entry whose row label is 1 and column label is 5, right? So this is the entry whose row label is 1 and column label is 5. right? At this entry we have stored the value 3. So this term represents the value 3. Now this term, it is equal to 4 plus D12, right? D12 is the value which is stored in the table at an entry whose row label is 1 and column label is 2, right? And it is 3, right? So 4 plus 3 is equal to 7. Now the largest value among these two values, 3 and 7, is 7, right? So the value of D25 will be 7, right? So here we will write 7, right? Now we have to fill this entry of the D table. Here row label is 3 and column label is 1, right? So here the value of I is 3 and value of j is equal to 1, right? Now ui is the value of ith item, so we must know the value of third item. The value of third item is 5 and weight of third item is 4, right? So ui will be equal to 5, right? And wi will be equal to 4, right? So weight of a third item is 4 and value of a third item is 5, right? So we know that Dij is equal to the maximum of Di minus 1 j or ui plus Di minus 1 j minus wi, right? Now here we will use this formula to find the value of D31, right? So D31 will be equal to the maximum of, here the value of I is 3 and value of j is 1, so maximum of D2 1, right? I minus 1 will be equal to 2 and j is equal to 1. Ui is 5 plus D I minus 1 j minus wi. I minus 1 will be 2 and j minus wi, it will be 1 minus 4 because wi is 4. So 1 minus 4 will be minus 3, right? Now we have to find the largest among these two values, right? Now see this term. This term is 5 plus D2 minus 3. D2 minus 3 is this term represents the value which is stored in the D table whose row is labeled by 2 and column is labeled by minus 3. Now in D table there is no column which is labeled by a negative number, so this term is not defined. So the largest among these two terms will be D21. So D31 will be equal to D21, right? So here we will write the value which is stored in this table at an entry whose row is labeled by 2 and column is labeled by 1, right? D21. So here the value stored is 0. Now at the entry whose row is labeled by 2 and column is labeled by 1, at that entry 0 is stored. So value of D31 will be 0. Now we have to fill this entry of D table. For this entry, label of row is 3 and label of column is 2, right? So here the value of I will be 3 and value of j will be 2. Now we have to find the value D32, right? We will find this value by using this formula and it will be the maximum of Di minus 1 j. Here I is 3, right? J is 2, so it will be 3 minus 1 is 2, 2. D22. Ui is 5 plus Di minus 1. I minus 1 will be 2 because I is 3. J minus wi. Now here j is 2. and wi is 4, so 2 minus 4 is minus 2, right? Now we have to find the value which is maximum among these two values, right? Now this term represents the value which is stored at the entry in a table whose row label is 2 and column label is also 2. So this is the entry whose row label is 2 and whose column label is also 2. So value stored at this entry is 3. So this term represents the value 3. Now see this term. Now see D2 minus 2, right? It represents the value stored in an entry whose row label is 2 and column label is minus 2. Now there is no column in this table which is labeled by a negative number. So this term is not defined, right? So the largest among these two values will be the value of this term, right? That is 3, because this term is not defined. So the value of D32 is 3, right? So the value which will be stored at an entry whose row label is 3 and column label is 2 will be 3, right? Now we have to fill this entry. Now we have to fill this entry of the T table, right? The row label of this entry is 3 and column label is also 3. So here the value of I and j will be 3. Value of I will be 3 and value of j will also be 3, because label of row is 3 and label of column is also 3, right? Now we have to find the value of D33, right? Because we have to fill the entry whose row label is 3 and whose column label is also 3, right? So here we have to fill this entry whose row label is 3 and column label is 3. So we have to find the value of D33, right? Here value of I is 3 and value of j is also 3. So again we will use this formula to find this value. We have to find the value which is maximum among these two values. First one is di minus 1 j. Here value of I is 3 and value of j is 3. So di minus 1 j will be d23. Second is ui plus, ui is 5 plus di minus 1 j minus wi, right? So it will be equal to d 3 minus 1, that is 2, j minus wi means 3 minus 4, right? 3 minus 4 is minus 1, right? Now we have to find the value which is largest among these two values, right? Now see here, see this term d2 minus 1. It represents the value which is stored at the entry in a T table whose row label is 2 and column label is minus 1. Now in table there is no column which is labeled by a negative number, so this term is not defined. So the largest value among these two values will be this one, T23. This term represents the value in T table which is stored in the entry whose row is labeled by 2 and column is labeled by 3, right? So this is the entry whose row is labeled by 2 and column is labeled by 3. Now value stored at this entry is 4, right? So D33 will be equal to 4. So here we will write 4, right? Now we have to fill this entry of the T table. Here row label is 3 and column label is 4, right? So here the value of I will be 3 and value of j will be 4, right? Value of I will be 3 and value of j will be 4. Now we have to fill the entry with row label 3 and column label 4. So we will find the value D34 and it is equal to maximum of di minus 1 j, right? Here I is 3 and j is 4, so it will be d 2 4 and ui plus di minus 1 j minus wi. Ui is 5 plus di minus 1 j minus wi. I minus 1 is 3 minus 1 is 2 and j is 4 and wi is 4. So j minus wi will be 0. Now we have to find the value which is largest among these two values. This term represents the value which is stored in D table at row label 2 and column label 4. This is the entry whose row label is 2 and column label is 4. Now at this entry value stored is 4, right? So D24 represents the value which is equal to 4. Now what value is represented by this term? This term represents the value 5 plus D20. D20 represents the value which is stored in D table at an entry with the row label 2 and column label 0. Now our entry with the row label 2 and column label 0 is this one, and value stored at this entry is 0, right? So value of D20 is 0. Now this term represents the value 5 plus 0, and 5 plus 0 is 5. So the largest value among these two values is 5. So D34 is 5. So here we will store 5, right? Now we have to fill this entry. Its row label is 3 and column label is 5. So here I will be equal to 3 and j will be equal to 5, right? Now we have to fill the entry with the row label 3 and column label 5. So we have to find the value of D35. So we will use this formula. Dij is equal to maximum di minus 1j or ui plus di minus 1j minus wi, right? So di minus 1j, it will be equal to d25, right? Because here I is equal to 3 and j is equal to 5, and ui is 5 plus di minus 1 j minus wi. It will be d 3 minus 1, that is 2, j is 5 and wi is 4, right? So j minus wi, it will be 5 minus 4 is 1, right? Now we have to find the value which is the largest among these two values, right? This term represents the value which is stored in D table at an entry whose row label is 2 and column label is 5. So the value which is stored in D table at an entry whose row label is 2 and column label is 5 is 7. So this term represents the value 7, and this term represents the value 5 plus the value which is stored in D table at entry whose row label is 2 and column label is 1. This is the entry whose row label is 2 and column label is 1, and value stored at this entry is 0, right? So this term represents the value 7, and this term represents the value 5 plus 0 is 5. Largest among these two is 7. So D35 will be 7. So here we will store the value 7, right? At the entry whose row label is 3 and column label is 5. Now we will fill all the entries of fourth row by using this formula. So here we have filled all the entries of this fourth row by using this formula, right? Now the value which is stored at the entry of last row and last column will give the maximum possible value which can be put in knapsack, right? Now this is the entry of last row and last column. Now the value stored at this entry is 7. So 7 is the maximum possible value which can be put in a knapsack, right? Now the maximum possible value which can be put in knapsack is 7. Now we have to decide which items should be put in knapsack to get this maximum possible value, right?